Welcome back. We continue our coverage on reactions to the worsening relations between South Africa and the United States. This follows U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's ex-post saying Rasool was not welcome in the U.S. for his criticism of Donald Trump policies. Now, for more on the story, I'm joined by Dr Lubna Nadvi, who's an international relations specialist with UKZN. Doc, thank you so much for your time and for joining us. So in your opinion, Doc, is South Africa effectively addressing the actions of the Trump administration? Are there signs that our country is dragging its feet in responding to this diplomatic challenge?
Hi, good evening. I think that we've heard from the Minister of International Relations, and he has very clearly stated that the South African state will be responding to this matter, and that the South African government really wants to maintain a good working relationship with advancing mutual interest. So I think that there's been a very sort of quick response from both the President's office as well as from the Minister of International Relations. And so I think that the response has been quick, but we now need to see, obviously, the actual actions that are going to take place. It's very unfortunate that the U.S. government decided to take the decision of expelling the South African ambassador to the United States. I think that that matter could have been handled differently. But given that the Secretary of State announced that, Ambassador Rasool is no longer welcome in the United States, the situation is what it is. And the South African government has to now use the diplomatic channels in order to ensure that the relationship between the two countries is going to be managed as best as possible.
And I can imagine how strategic South Africa is trying to move in managing these relationships. But Doc, I mean, it's a lot has been happening over time. I mean, apart from this expulsion, there's been the executive orders, the withdrawal of funds, and there doesn't really seem to be a robust discussion between the two nations. Is this meant to be? Is it strategic?
I think that the actions taken by the United States government is something that the South African government really has no control over. The current U.S. administration has expressed itself in a very specific way. It's become more of a sort of right-wing government, and it has certain policies that it has put into place. And of course, it is also acting based on information that has been provided to it, especially around the issue of the sort of supposed confiscation of land. And so there's a lot of misinformation that it actually is acting upon. And what needs to happen is that that misinformation has to be corrected. So the sort of cutting off of aid to South Africa in terms of the various programs that the U.S. aid government supported and so on. It's unfortunate that there's been a lot of, let's call it miscommunication between the two countries. But the South African government has also taken, I think, a strong stance. As President Ramaphosa has said, we will not be bullied. And it was important for him to actually make that stance. So the U.S. government has acted in ways that really are unfortunate. It's acted, towards other governments that it doesn't like or that it has a problem with their policies in a similar way. So the South African government now just has to respond to the reality that it faces. And effectively, I think that, it will act within, obviously, the sort of legal frameworks. The issue is that the diplomatic relations between South Africa and America are between two states. They're not between individuals and personalities. But here, what we have is a unique situation of the personality of Donald Trump and members of his administration acting in certain ways, and our government officials and our state has to respond to those actions, and so that is where we are. But I do think that the South African government has taken a strong stance that it will act legally. It has to, of course, support Ambassador Rasool and take the sort of relevant actions that are required. But I think that the relationship between the two countries will not be damaged or destroyed to the extent that there won't be any communication between them. I think it just requires, as you said, robust conversations to correct misinformation and to ensure that relationships continue. There's strong trade relationships between the two countries. There's strong cultural and other people-to-people engagement between South Africa and the United States, and those things need to continue, and the two governments need to learn to work with each other to ensure that those kinds of engagements can actually continue.
So, Doc, with that said, what leverage does South Africa have in its dealings with the Trump administration? Can we better in any way ourselves in terms of positioning ourselves in negotiations and discussions?
I think that the South African government has shown that it actually has become a leader within the global community. The fact that it's hosting the G20 this year, the fact that it has a leading role on the African continent on many issues. So the fact that it is part of BRICS and it recently hosted the BRICS summit. So it's shown itself to be a very strong leader in the global community. And the leverage it has is that it has obviously the respect of the international community and certainly other African countries. In terms of other things that it can use, it has a strong human rights, stance. It has a very strong constitution, which I think basically ensures that it sort of comes across as a leader on the international front. It has strong trade sort of ties with other countries. So I think its position within BRICS, its position within the broader African continent, and certainly within what you would call the sort of South region, would certainly stand it in good stead. And the president of the country has, of course, shown himself to be someone who is not going to back down. Of course, he may come under criticism for certain things that the South African government does. But I think on the international front, President Ramaphosa, as well as his Minister of International Relations, Ronald Ramola, and other ministers that engage with the international community have shown themselves to be very strong. What needs to happen, though, now is that the officials on both sides need to set up a meeting and they need to have a conversation to fix the if there's been a breakdown in relationships, which there has been to some degree. If you expel the ambassador of a country, it means that there is a breakdown of communication to a certain degree. So
Right.
that diplomatic issue has to be resolved. And I think that we will get through it. But the personalities that are in place at the moment, certainly with Donald Trump, create challenges for us as South Africa.
But speaking of challenges and bringing them back home, how might domestic political considerations in our country influence its response to the expulsion of our ambassador? Are there factions within government that may affect decision making?
Yes, I mean, we have a very complex domestic political situation. We have a government of national unity where political parties don't agree with each other. We've seen this recently in our budget, speech situation. And I think that there has been criticism of the way perhaps Ambassador Rasool handled himself or the statements that he made. And that's coming from the local domestic context. There's fears that because he's now been expelled, that it will affect other aspects of South Africa's relationship with the United States, like the AGOA agreements, the trade, issues, and whatever other bilateral agreements have been sort of put in place. So I think that the local domestic context does play a role, but at the end of the day, the diplomatic channels, there's an international legal framework within which the diplomatic relationship works. And so that has to be sustained. And I think that also cool heads have to prevail. So everyone has to act, maturely and responsibly. But within the local context, we've seen how, for example, organizations like AfriForum and other groups have engaged with the United States government, as sort of non-state to state engagement. And that's created a bit of a problem because really the relationship should be between states and not necessarily non-state to state, where you then have other dynamics that start to come in. So I think where we are right now, we need to ensure that we go back to the state to state interaction so that the relationship can be repaired in terms of whatever dynamics have emerged. And the sort of information that the United States government has about what's going on in South Africa, because obviously it's acted based on that information, has to also be rectified. And that has to come from the state, the South African state, and not necessarily, civil society actors here locally in South Africa.
And what long-term impact do you think that non-state to state engagement does for a country?
So I think that the kind of situation that Donald Trump set up, where he is saying to citizens, well, you can now, especially to white farmers, you can now come to America and get, citizenship. Um, is problematic, and even American officials have said that this kind of behavior by a president is really not appropriate, because of the fact that you've got vulnerable people here in South Africa that think that they're going to now get this wonderful outcome by all ending up in United States as citizens and what have you. Um, and that really is not how the international system works. You can't simply, I mean, you could have a president offering asylum to citizens of another country because there's war that's unfolding, or civil war, and those people are given refugee status. But at the end of the day, based on misinformation that white farmers are having their land taken away from them, and they're sort of being subjected to all kinds of, as Trump called it, bad things happening to them, is misinformation. We remember that this sort of thing happened under the uh, corruption, or the sort of state capture period, when misinformation was being circulated. So what it does, as you asked, is that it creates incorrect assumptions about the situation on the ground. Trump does not live in South Africa. He doesn't know what goes on every day. And you get somebody or a civil society organization that gives information to a head of state of another country, which is incorrect and inaccurate, it creates problems for the ongoing relationship between both countries at government level.
All right, Doc, thank you so much for your time and for your insights this evening. It certainly has been very insightful. Thank you for joining us today.